Hey, good morning, everybody. And can we pause here and just say, Happy New Year? Here it is. We have arrived at 2026. And the first thing that we want to ask is, so what do we have planned, right? I know that our normal traditions in the past have been you make a list of things that you want to accomplish for 2026, what we call New Year's resolutions, normally encompassing some sort of life change. So it's something like I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to, read more, or maybe I'm going to start a project and actually complete it. Or maybe you're going to take that trip with the family that you've always planned, or whatever the case is, right? Can we wait on those? And the only reason why is I say this. All the ideas that you may have as New Year's resolutions are phenomenal New Year's resolutions. I'm not going to bag on or get on your case about those. In fact, I'm saying hold on to those. But can we do ourselves a favor? One of the main things that we ended last year with was we went through the Christmas story. But one of the last passages that we looked at was this kind of conversation that happens with Jesus at 12 years old. And he finds himself at the temple. And here he is doing what he should have been doing. And his parents kind of walked up to him all upset because they kind of left him behind for a few days. Right? And so they kind of go into a panic and they look at him. And I love Mary's heart. She goes, hey, what did we do to deserve this, kiddo? Like, why did you just run off? And the answer that Jesus gives us, why were you looking for me? Which we have to always stop. Whenever Jesus asks a question, you guys have to ask yourself, why is he asking? I thought he was God. I thought he knew everything. All of that is absolutely true. That being said, then maybe the question isn't for him, but maybe it's for you. Why do I bring that up? Because we're about to walk into 2026. And before we start making the plans and the resolutions and the here's what I'm going to do, maybe we could say, you know what, 2026, you're going to pause. I want 2026 to be the year that I waste my time in prayer, that I waste my time in his word, and that my goal of 2026 isn't going to be to just accomplish things. Again, they are good things. But maybe the goal of 2026 is, Jesus, I want to have intimacy with you. My goal is going to be presence. In other words, I want God to be with me and I with him. I want to encounter Emmanuel for 2026. And that might look like accomplishing my goals. And then it might also look like maybe those things don't all get done because I spent more time sitting at his feet, hearing his voice, and learning to be the kind of apprentice that not only practices the way of living as Jesus did, but ultimately also more naturally obeys him. How do we get that done is the question. Because it's a lot easier, especially when it comes to church. So just preach sermons. Like, let's just, as we honestly are creating a culture where we call it, consumer Christianity. It's you come to church and you hear a good sermon, it makes you feel good and you go home. And that's pretty much it. For pastors, it's we felt really good because we preached a sermon and everyone felt good and they went home. But how many years have we done that? And it's just not functioning. It's not working. So here is my goal for 2026, presence. But the question is, as a pastor, it's like the whole, I can draw a horse to water, but I can't make them drink. It's the same as I can create the space and the environment for us here online and equally at home and as well as here at church, where, it's all set up so that we can encounter the presence of Jesus. But then we ourselves, you, the listener, I myself have to make the decision, but do you want it? Because if you want it, then you're going to have to do the mundane things in order to encounter his presence. One of the things that we decided this year is instead of just, let's go through a series, we're not going through a series. What you're listening to is the first of many, conversations on, we are going to sit down with this gospel and we are going to sit down with Jesus and we are going to sit down and learn from the master as we watch him and encounter him and interact with the text so that the text is not being controlled by us, but it's controlling us itself. And we are encountering not the Bible in and of itself, but rather the one that it represents. We want to encounter its author, its finisher, and the one who creates faith, and that is Jesus himself. encountering the Father through his presence and glory, talking with our one and only Savior, Jesus, and then having the empowerment of the Holy Spirit to then live out the realities that we are encountering. Hopefully that all makes sense. Which is why today we aren't specifically looking at any specific text other than Mark 1:1, because that's literally where we'll be launching off from here on in. But can I give you guys kind of before we walk into the Gospel of Mark, this conversation today? Why the Gospel of Mark? Who is John Mark? Who is he writing to? Why is he writing to? It's all if we can kind of wrap our heads around the whole if we can do like a flyover, if you will, like an airplane looking down at our country saying, okay, now I can see the bigger picture. That is what we want to do today. We want to kind of go over the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because 2026, we are more focused on presence. And the only way we're going to do that is if we hang out in the one place that God always hangs out. Can I tell you guys, you can go to mountains, beaches, rivers, and God, yes, will meet you there. But if there's one place that you will always encounter God, guaranteed, that is his word. Why? Because he never leaves it alone. Never. Prove me wrong. Anytime you read the Bible, you always experience something, whether it's some sort of, guidance, whether it's a aha, whether it's a peace or a shalom, or whether it's even conviction that says, this is just like sandpaper on my heart. Like, why is it bothering me? And that's what it's intended to do. But notice all that is happening because God is at work when you are listening and reading and have your face stuck in his word. So, Pastor Johnny, why'd you pick Mark? Why not Matthew? Why not Luke? Why not John? Because those are phenomenal gospels. But Mark is one of my favorite ones. Okay, I'm just going to confess it. 2 reasons why. 1, Mark is my favorite because it's so short. Okay, 16 chapters. Get to the point, right? And the second thing is the one word that you will hear in Mark very often, and immediately. And immediately, boom, boom, boom. What I love about Mark is the way that he wrote his gospel was he was not like taking it slow until chapter 11. So just letting you guys know, the gospel will slow down around chapter 11. But for the most part, Mark is just like, and then this, and then this, and then this, and he's intending to get you almost like in a rush. Like you just can't slow down. I will confess that once upon a time in college, I used to love riding my longboard. It's a skateboard that's almost as tall as I am. And I would, take that everywhere, except for that one time when I went down a really long hill and I had this thing called speed wobble. I fell off that thing so fast. And there's even more to the story we'll share at a different time. But this was the intensity of Mark is like, we are bombing this hill. We're going down. And here we go. We're following Jesus. So that's kind of his pace of his gospel. But there are moments when you'll notice the gospel halts. And when it does, we have to sit and let the awkwardness of it got quiet all of a sudden sink in. So, some facts about John Mark. And if you guys are okay with it, I do memorize my notes for the most part, but sometimes you just want to have a little bit more detail here. So who wrote the Gospel of Mark? So that's where we begin. First off, who's its author? Well, that's the funny thing. Unlike other gospel writers, this author didn't put his name in it. So it's ambiguous. It's anonymous, in other words. There's no author. Oh no, what's going to happen? Hold on. Because of research and scholarly, work that has been done, there is this guy, okay? So there is this kind of bishop, if you will. His name is Papias. And this guy decided to write down that, hey, there is this gospel. It is written by this person by the name of John Mark. And he's saying, I don't personally know that. Rather, he had documented down that he had a conversation with the elder. So who's the elder? Well, if you guys don't know about Christian history, of all the disciples that Jesus had, they were all martyred except for one. There's one that wasn't martyred, and he was the youngest of the group. He is the one that's called the one Jesus loved, aka, you guessed it, John, the gospel writer of John, and also the letters of John, the one and only, right? Remember, he was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he has, the encounter with God and that we call today Revelation. That's what he wrote down, right? Well, he was also known as the elder. Why is he called the elder? Because he was the last one that was living that actually walked this earth with Jesus. Could you imagine that? So here's this bishop, guy, Papias, or however you want to say his name, And he wrote down in a letter, in a book or whatever, he just said, hey, I had a conversation with the elder, referring to John, and John said that this writer of this gospel is John Mark. Now, John Mark, why does it sound familiar? Well, John Mark, by the way, again, this is all facts and figures. We're kind of jumping around and it's okay. It's all part of learning, right? John Mark is a cousin of another guy by the name of Barnabas. Now, if you're like, Barnabas, that also rings a bell. Yes. If you remember, Barnabas is the basically co-laborer with Paul. Now we're going into the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, we find out that Paul the apostle was going on missionary journeys, going around Europe, declaring the gospel of Jesus, sharing with people who Jesus was, and showing the kingdom, right? As he was doing that, he had a partner, and that was Barnabas. So Barnabas is hanging out with him, the son of encouragement, and it's just amazing. Well, he has a cousin, and that cousin is John Mark. So John Mark comes along, and he goes on the first missionary journey. It's going pretty well. He gets a lot of his information from Peter, hearing first accounts and stuff like that. But then eventually he gets to, I think it's Pergama or one of those cities, and he kind of turns back and goes back home. As a result, it causes a little bit of tension between Paul and the young John Mark, where he goes, hey man, like you can't do this whole like I miss my home or whatever. So he's like, just go home. So they had some sort of disagreement. And as a result of that disagreement, unfortunately, Paul and Barnabas also separate and they go their separate ways, which is a bummer. However, there is reconciliation that happens because of other parts of the Bible that we read. You come to find out that Paul says, will you send John Mark to me because he is very beneficial to the ministry. Not only that, if you read in Peter's letters, Peter also mentions John Mark and says, John Mark to me is like a son, like a spiritual son. So here we have the connection that he has here. And notice that Peter treats him like a son. Why? Because, well, according to scholars, where does Mark get his information? And they all agree. 99% of the information that John Mark attained it because he was listening to Peter. He was hanging out with Peter and he was like, hey, Peter, tell me about. And so Peter would kind of tell him one story after another. And then he compiled the stories along with another resource called Q, which is just some other, collection of writings maybe John Mark had together, or maybe he collected from different people. So combined Peter's testimony along with this thing called Q, this is what makes the Gospel of Mark. And Gospel of Mark was written around 60 AD. And we'll get into why that matters, but he wrote it with the intention of writing it to a very specific group. So now that we know more about John Mark, okay, who he is, he's not a stranger. He wasn't a direct disciple of Jesus, meaning he didn't meet Jesus one-on-one, but rather he met the disciples of Jesus, and that's how he got to know. He writes his gospel, and his gospel is different than the other ones because it's missing a lot of Old Testament stuff. Unlike Matthew just throws Old Testament quotes at you all the time, right? And the reason being, Matthew's audience is Jewish. Not Mark's though. See, Mark's audience, he is writing from Rome, and he is writing to a Roman group of believers. And if you can think about it, if they're in Rome and they're believers, chances are they're Gentiles. Aha. So this is what Mark kind of does in his gospel. He doesn't go into the details of quoting Old Testament stuff because he knows his audience really doesn't know the Old Testament. Instead, what he does is if he does quote the Old Testament, he does a very, elaborate job of saying, by the way, this is a Jewish thing. Can I explain the background to this Jewish thing real quick? So Mark does a lot of explaining of Jewish traditions. He also does a lot of explaining of why this is written down and who it was written about and why does it apply here. And then he does a lot of translating, meaning if there's anything written in Hebrew or anything in the original, like Aramaic, he's talking to Greek and or Latin speaking believers, which are in Rome. So when he writes things, he goes, they're not going to know what that means. They're not going to understand this language. So let me translate it. And a lot of the stuff that he presents is either in Latin or in Greek. So now that we understand his audience, Roman believers, right? They're Gentiles. So thus, this is more of a Greek, Latin kind of flavor text that we are reading. It is short because he literally just found his stories from Peter and also this resource called Q. And honestly, it just cracks me up because we'll get more into the detail as we look at the actual story that he writes. But there is kind of the beginning backgrounds of the Gospel of Mark. Now, 16 chapters. Unlike other people, other gospel writers who have for sure more chapters than that, you're like, 16, why so much? Okay, now let's look at the structure of how this gospel is written, okay? For one, what is his whole goal? Well, his whole goal can be found in a single story. And I'll tell you this. I say two stories. The first story is this. In the gospel, we are told that, well, once upon a time, Jesus gets into a boat, right? Mark tells us this. And as he gets into a boat, he goes out with the rest of them, and the storm starts to take over. The storm is overwhelming, and it just kind of becomes a lot. So then here's Mark telling a story that Jesus is asleep. And where is he asleep? In the back of the boat. Worst place, by the way, to ever take a nap inside of a ship, especially in a storm. So that's his whole situation. There he goes, right? As that happens, all of a sudden, the disciples are literally throwing out buckets of water, and they finally shake Jesus awake, and they're like, do you not care that we drown? Jesus, half asleep still, directs his attention towards the storm and says, quiet, be still. The storm, by the way, which the wind, the waves, everything, boom, silence. We're talking clear water. The sky is quiet. What just happened, right? All of this happens, and the disciples ask one question as they are all collected on the opposite side of the boat, scared of him. Who is this? That's the question. Who is this, right? When we read the Gospel of Mark, that answer is given so many times that you can't ignore the fact that this is Mark's theme throughout the gospel. Who is this guy? And the answer given by demons, given by Romans, given by like the disciples to a certain degree, it's all these random people and events declare clearly as ever, this is the Son of God. We can break down Mark's gospel into 3 sections. It'd be more appropriate to break it down to 4. And the reason why, Mark does have a prologue, meaning it's hey, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about why we're writing this. And he starts off very clearly. This is the gospel, meaning the good news. Again, I said, would we read the Bible today? We did. And here it is, John 1:1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Off the bat, he already says, what is my intention here? My intention is to declare to you and to show you who are reading this gospel, that Jesus is the promised Messiah and in fact the Son of God. And then the rest of the story is showing you and declaring to you how that is true. So there's a prologue, very tiny prologue, followed by, section number 1 of Mark is what Jesus did in Galilee. So in his kind of hometown, right? So there's his main ministry that happens there. The second portion is what we call the transitional, not meaning that there's some sort of transition happening, except for he's leaving Galilee and now he's moving slowly. I shouldn't use the word slowly because it's Mark. He's moving quickly, but it takes a while. Mark makes it very clear, and it's the whole immediately, right? So you have Galilee ministry, followed by him leaving Galilee and now slowly making his way towards Jerusalem. Then section 3 is now that we're in Jerusalem, everything slows down. Mark literally from chapter 11 on is focused on the week that Jesus is in Jerusalem, dealing with his opposition and also about to face the cross. Here's the weird thing about Mark. One, Mark is written, again, scholars agree, around 60 AD. And why does that matter? Well, if we take an even greater approach, like back up a second, not just on the gospel, on history. Prior to Jesus showing up, Rome was in turmoil. Like it was rough. And the reason why, because here you have Caesar, Julius Caesar, right? He's in charge of Rome. First off, he didn't just randomly become in charge of all of Rome. He kind of had this kind of, battle between him and Pompey. So Pompey was trying to take control of everything. Julius Caesar's trying to, support him, but then eventually opposes him. And eventually Pompey loses, and then Julius Caesar becomes power. However, as he becomes the main sense of power, there were other people that were threatened in that power. So they think the best thing to do is before he becomes a tyrant, kill him. Well, they do. His son, Octavian, who is in the background somewhere, eventually will come back. But eventually, as he is murdered, then his second in command, otherwise known as Mark Antony, comes into power, right? So he comes into power, temporarily, like super not very, he's not really good at ruling, and let alone he's got this thing with Cleopatra and whatever. History tells all about that. But eventually he also dies. So then after that, then there are other rulers that get involved, but eventually Octavian, his son, actually comes back into the fold, but he changes his name to Caesar Augustus, or Augustus Caesar. He's not the Caesar from before, but he is in fact now walking in the steps of his father, saying, hey, just like my dad, declaring his dad to be God, and then declaring himself as the son of God. Again, all of that matters. Because now there's this, folks, there's been so much bloodshed and tension in the process of Caesar Augustus becoming the ruler. He also implements this one guy named Herod, which you're like, Herod, you mean like from the Christmas story? Yes. See, all of this starts to play a role. But Rome is in this sense of just violence, and it's one of those, if somebody breathes wrong, this whole country, this whole government is going to topple, which eventually it does. So what ends up happening? Why does it matter that Mark wrote his gospel around 60 AD? Because one, it shows a duration of time from the time that Jesus, dies on the cross and ascends into heaven and is resurrected to the time that a gospel is actually written, put together. There's time that has elapsed. And other gospel writers are also compiling and putting stuff together, Luke and John and Matthew. But the thing is, Luke and Matthew, you can tell when you read the gospels and compare them all together, Matthew and Luke draw a lot of their information from Mark. That is why Mark is technically the first gospel that was written. And the timeline that it was written would show that it's also one of the first gospels that was written to begin with. So here's John Mark writing something, and there's something within his gospel that ultimately shows you the, what's going on? See, eventually we run into Nero. So after Caesar Augustus and all the rest of them, we eventually get Nero. Nero is a psychopath. He is destructive. He is hurtful. He loves to just be a tyrant. So here's Nero in charge of Rome. And he decides that he's going to have parties. These parties happen at night, and the only way to light up the party is to have some sort of candles, right? Everywhere. You could do that. Or Nero style, you decide to grab the Christians and you decide to dip them in tar, hang them upside down, and light them on fire. And now their bodies are the ones lighting your parties. Wow. You're like, that is, whoa. Okay. And as a believer, you start to see this and you start to ask the question, God, where are you? So this is why he begins to write his gospel right at 60 AD, right when the tension's getting super hot, and right before the fire explodes. And what do I mean by that? At 70 AD, you see that the temple is destroyed, demolished completely. Funny, because what did Jesus say? In the Gospel of Mark, he makes sure to write down, not knowing, here's what's about to happen around the corner. But in the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus says, no stone will be left on top of another. It's all going to be tumbled. And you will see this temple just ruins. And everyone's like, that's never going to happen. It's amazing. Oh, are you just kidding? 10 years after this gospel is written, a Roman Christian would be reading it, looking up at the world and looking at a temple that is now completely demolished and destroyed. And yet he's reading it in a book that was written 10 years ago. And there's that, oh my goodness, it's true. This Jesus guy was telling the truth. This was all part of the... Prior to Jesus showing up, there were dozens of people saying, I'm this Messiah, I'm that Messiah. I'm including Augustus Caesar, who said, I'm the son of God because my dad was God. Therefore, that makes me. So it's all of these misconceptions of son of God and Messiah and all this. Jesus shows up, and I find this very interesting because this kind of changes the trajectory of the gospel itself. Is that here Jesus is just doing ministry, boom, 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 from one thing to another, casting out demons, declaring, the sick to be well, having people who are crippled all of a sudden be able to use their limbs. All of this, right? Amazing. And eventually, Jesus goes up to Peter and says to Peter, or more specifically, just to all the disciples, but Peter's Mr. I'm going to speak for everyone. And he says, who do you say that I am? Again, there's that question. There's that question. And what does Peter declare? You are the Christ, the Son of God. As soon as that comes out of Peter's mouth, the rest of the gospel, Jesus does something very interesting. He hears him say, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God," and goes, "Ah, good. That's not from you, Peter. That is from above. Otherwise, you couldn't have figured that out." However, I need to talk to you guys about something, because the question that is now on the table is, what kind of Messiah is Jesus? See, everyone was expecting a political leader, a swords in hand on a white horse. Let's just, start killing Romans and start destroying the other governments, and we are going to be the ones in charge of the world. And instead, what does Jesus do? He shifts the image of Messiah and says, hold on. You guys misunderstood something. Isaiah 53 says, and he starts to share with his apprentices that the Messiah has to suffer and die, be crucified for the sake of the forgiveness of sins of all peoples. Oh, the plan just changed. Oh, it's not what anyone was anticipating. And for that matter, may not have been whatever anybody wanted. Wow. This is the Gospel of Mark. And before we can dive into the rest of Mark, or the beginning of Mark for that matter, the question that I have for you is the same question that would have been presented before every Roman believer who is about to be handed this story in this gospel. Who do you say Jesus is? Or rather, who is Jesus to you? The answer is what we're going to find out as we study this gospel. And the answer will only be found out if you spend intimate time with him and let him show you what kind of Messiah he is. I'm excited. Grace and peace be with you all. Happy New Year. And I'm excited to see what God is going to do this year, because I feel like he's going to blow us away. This is the way. We'll see you guys.